today. We are excited that you have joined us on today, and we look forward to a great experience. I'd like to tell you a little bit about the webinar and what you're going to experience today by walking through the agenda with you. First, you'll get an update on our work group, the Extension Racial Equity and Food Systems Work Group, followed by an introduction to the Coming Together for Racial Understanding Initiative, which is a national training that's happening in Cooperative Extension Services, followed by a little bit of an introduction also to the curriculum that is utilized in that training. You'll have the pleasure of hearing from 4 of our steering committee members who participated in that training. And they'll each spend about 5 minutes telling you a little bit about their experience, about themselves and their experience with the training. And then we'll open it up. This is the part that we're most looking forward to, is listening to your questions and answering your questions about the things that the presenters have shared. And then followed up, we'll tell you a little bit more about the resources that are available through our work group. And so with that, I would like to introduce Lucy Diekman. She is the founder of the work group, and she's going to give you a little bit of information about what we've been doing and get you up to date. Lucy?
Thank you, Renee. Before I turn things over to our speakers, I wanted to provide a brief introduction to the Racial Equity in the Food System Working Group. This group is intended to be a community of cooperative extension professionals and community stakeholders who connect, learn, and collaborate to facilitate change within our institutions and society to build racial equity within the food system. 2018 has been a really exciting year for us, with support from MSU's Center for Regional Food Systems and with funding from the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. We've been working to increase our capacity. As part of that effort, we just launched a new webpage where you can learn more about us and find our webinars as well as other resources. The link is on the bottom of the screen, and I encourage you to visit and check us out. We've also had the opportunity to expand our National Steering Committee. We now have 12 members, and they include, and perhaps we could go, oh, there we go, great, next slide. Those include Tamara Ajay with the University of Tennessee, Charlotte Ammons at North Carolina State Extension, myself with University of California Cooperative Extension, Rachel Lindvall with South Dakota State University, Lindsay Lunsford with Tuskegee University, Shatomi Lester Edward with the University of Missouri, Vanessa Garcia Polanco at Michigan State University, Joyce Senior with Oregon State University Extension, Courtney Simmons with the University of New Hampshire Extension, Crystal Tyler Mackey with Virginia Cooperative Extension, and Renee Wallace with Doers Consulting Alliance in Michigan. And then finally, Rich Pirog, who's the director of the MSU Center for Regional Food Systems. And with that, it's my pleasure to now turn things over to Rich, who will provide some more background for today's webinar.
Okay. Thank you very much, Lucy. Glad to have you all here with us this afternoon or morning, depending on which time zone that you're in. What I'm going to do here is just give a very brief context of one important initiative that Cooperative Extension has put together over the last 2 years. And I want to reinforce something that Renee said in the opening comments. We're really going to present to you in a very short time frame. We really want most of this time together to hear more of some of the issues you have and to connect you. So we've built that capacity enough to do that in concert with this webinar. So here's a little bit of background on how we got here for the Coming Together for Racial Understanding program. And I first just want to note that we have a person who is not going to have a formal presenting role, but has been the leader for this work, and that's Rachel Wellborn, Associate Director with the Southern Rural Development Center in Mississippi State University. You see her email there. And if as we move forward, if you have questions specifically about this program and what maybe what the future of this program will be for Coming Together for Racial Understanding, Rachel Wellborn will try to answer some of those questions. So here's how we started. A lot of you in Extension are familiar with what's called ECOP, or the Extension Committee on Organization Policy. Shortly after the 2016 election, formed a rapid response team to try to get at where Extension's role could be in the whole area of civil dialogue and race relations, and what Extension's current competency is, how that should, what kind of role Extension should play as we move forward into a time when it's clear that probably more than other times in our very recent history, our country has a lot of divisions on a lot of different issues, including race. So that committee, which Rachel Wellborn led, about 20 people from around the country pulled together a report that was sent to the Extension Committee on Organizational Policy. Rachel led a national webinar, and there was raised a lot of awareness about some of the questions and issues, and there clearly was a need and an interest for Extension to go further and develop this. So Rachel and myself and others were able to procure funds from ECOP and other sources. A curriculum team was formed in fall of 2017 to look at various curriculums, and with Rachel's leadership and another large planning team, a national planning team, a national Train the Trainer event occurred in August of 2018, just a few months ago, at the National 4-H Center. We'll go to the next slide. So at this national training, we wanted to keep the size manageable, so because there was a lot of facilitation and intensive work, both reflective work and small group work. So it was small. So we had teams from 20 states. You could see here there was certainly a lot more groups from east of the Rockies than there were west of the Rockies, and we had teams of at least 3 people. We had a number of historically black colleges and universities, or 1890 institutions, that also participated, and it was a week-long workshop with several curriculum parts. To talk more about what actually happened and the next steps for coming together for racial understanding, I'd like to introduce a colleague and a fellow MSU partner in a lot of work on racial equity, Leonardo Piziana.
Thanks, Rich, and again, thanks to all of you that are attending the webinar today. I want to start out by talking about our curriculum and what it is that we focused on in that week-long training. So the curriculum started out with a day and a half that focused on what I would encompass as doing our own work. We felt that it was very important that we not assume that people coming to this training had done work around issues of race and racism. And what was particularly interesting, I think, to all of us was that we were having these dialogues from a standpoint of people that were there from across the country. And I think it led to some really good relationship building, and then also some issues came up that will also be mirrored in the phases of the training that we're moving forward. We also had the opportunity through a partnership with Everyday Democracy and staff at Mississippi State University to have our participants engage in the 2 models that we're now asking them to use in year 1 of this project internally with their extension colleagues, and then in year 2 to have the focus be on helping to train interested extension staff to take these models into community settings. So the first model that we engaged with was through Everyday Democracy. It's a guidebook and a process called Facing Racism in a Diverse Nation. And the second dialogue model was through Mississippi State University, Dialogues for Community Healing. Again, we had a chance to experience, in one case, the whole curriculum, in another case, a portion of it. And then each of the participants was able to make a decision individually which of these curriculums they now want to offer with their colleagues in the first year of this initiative. So you can go to the next slide. So the next slide here helps to just give you a sense of what we're wanting to accomplish through this initiative, and it's put into year 1 and year 2. But what I would say is that my vision is that this would be something that continues to inform the work and the relationships that we do in our state organizations and extension, but also to help build capacity internally so that extension can be seen as a resource in our communities to do work around equity, diversity, equity, and inclusion. So in August 2018, we had the Train the Trainer event, and we provided the opportunity to build some foundational skills around dialogue and race relations. We had diverse teams from different states attending, and then we focused year 1 of this initiative to be an internal process. So we wanted those that attended the training to focus on offering one of these 2 models to their organizations internally with their colleagues. First, as a way to get the conversation going or continuing within their organizations, and then secondly, to maybe identify some extension staff, their colleagues that might be interested in taking these models into more of a community setting. We then look at year 2 of this initiative to recruit staff to go through a Train the Trainer at the local level so that they can then provide these trainings within their local communities. So we're moving through this process. We're going to probably hear more in the next few slides from individual states and how they've how each of us is trying to put this process into play in our local organizations.
Okay, folks, what you're going to see pop up on your screens momentarily is a poll question before we hear from our panelists. We want to get a better sense of the 300 plus participants about this question. How would you characterize the current level of work and activity in your state related to racial equity in the food system? And by food system, we mean work that's connected to agriculture, health, nutrition, community food. Much of the work that Cooperative Extension and our nonprofit and state and local government folks do around food and ag would fit under this umbrella. So we're going to take just a minute here while you continue to share which of these choices best fits your state. Okay, here's where we wound up, folks, in this quick poll. We found that over 50% of the respondents said that there was a moderate level of work and activity in your state. 16% said none to little, while 14% said significant, and about 17% said I don't know. Something we're going to be able to do later, we hope, is to look at this data a little bit more closely from both a geographic perspective and also a perspective of whether you represented educational institutions or nonprofit organizations or state or local government. So this was very helpful, and it gives you all a snapshot also that obviously there are very few of you, a very small percentage of you, that feel that a significant amount of work is happening in your state. A lot feel a moderate amount, which is good, but I think we would all agree, those that you're on this webinar, we'd love to see that a poll like this shift to see the majority of folks saying significant as we move forward. So thank you for filling out that poll results. Do I need to click share results, or have you done that?
Already done.
Okay, so you all have seen the results there. So thank you for indulging us in that poll question. I'm going to turn things back over to Renee.
All righty. Thank you for that, Rich. And before I introduce the speaking order, just want to let all of the participants know we want to thank you for the questions that you sent to us in advance. They did really help the discussants and the steering committee to design this webinar. So the questions have been insightful for that, as well as they're helping us to look at the work that we do going forward. So you can, while the presenters are sharing, they're going to each speak roughly 5 minutes. You can use the Q&A box to enter questions along the way. And once the presenters are done, we will close out that part and go right into the Q&A, and we'll be answering your questions in the order that they're coming in to the Q&A window. One other thing I failed to mention at the beginning, I'll share now, is that the slides that you're seeing in the presentation, along with the webinar recording, will be available to all of the participants on this webinar on today. And so with that, I will introduce the order that our speakers will be talking in are as follows. Lindsay, followed by Crystal, Tamara, and Shatomi. And these are all steering committee members and were the folks that Lucy introduced to us a little bit earlier. So with that, take it away, Lindsay.
Thank you, Renee. Hello, everyone. My name is Lindsay Lunsford. I am a Sustainable Food System Resource Specialist here at Tuskegee University, the Tuskegee University, and I work for the Tuskegee University Cooperative Extension Program. And of course, I'm located here in Tuskegee, Alabama, and our Cooperative Extension Program, we serve 20 Black Belt counties in Alabama's Black Belt. And I was very privileged and lucky enough and happy to have gone to the Coming Together for Racial Understanding training that happened in DC in Chevy Chase, Maryland. And you can see in the photo here that this is myself with my state team. I'm there on the left. In the middle, you have Dr. Lost connection with you guys. Of course, that would happen right when I'm, okay. With no further ado, I'm just gonna pick back up and keep going with that. So we were in DC. We traveled from DC. I traveled to DC with the Alabama State team, met a wealth of people, so many teams that were interested in doing this work, engaged in doing this work, got fired up about doing this work, and came back to Tuskegee with the ideas and the format to do the Tuskegee Public Dialogue Team, which is Tuskegee's take on how we can get this work done, this Coming Together for Racial Understanding work, how we can adopt the models and the curriculum that we learned and that we were given at the training and using it with our clientele, with our specific needs, and with our demographics that we have here, especially in the South and in the Black Belt. So from doing that, we decided, our leadership here at Tuskegee University, our directors decided that we needed to further flesh out this plan, this program of how we could develop our team. So I was sent, along with the 3 people you see in the photo to the right, we were sent to E-Extension's first National Impact Collaborative Summit, which was held October 15th through the 19th in Indianapolis, Indiana. Go Hoosiers, I'm originally from Indiana. So we were happy to be in the home state, and we presented, and we were along with 5 other teams that had been at the Coming Together for Racial Understanding training. We actually got to sit and work with our Purdue teammates that were at the training and develop. And also Renee was there and other people that helped us develop our curriculum, develop our concept maps, so we could really move forward with this plan of this program of the Tuskegee Public Dialogue Team. We then developed a plan, and we did a pitch, and we were in the pitch competition, and so we were able to win best top pitch overall, and as well as a most fundable category. And I'm joined there with my teammates Sheila DeHeer, Danielle Smith, and Marquez James. And so it was very, very empowering to not only receive that recognition, but just to hear how this work is needed across our network, across the nation, and how it's so inspiring to people after the competition, after the pitch. Oh, and Shatomi, of course, was there with the DEI. She'll talk more about that, but it was so inspiring. Our work was so inspiring to other people that after the competition across the nation, people reached out to us and just wanted to learn more. They were very hungry. They were very engaged. And so from then, continuing forward, working with REFS, the Racial Equity in the Food System Working Group, it's just seen that there's a real need for this work. And not only a need, of course, for food systems people. So there's a hunger, not to be too cliche-ish, but there's a hunger within our body, within our profession, to understand how to have these conversations in a way that doesn't hurt, but in a way that acknowledges hurt and moves forward. So my biggest takeaway is the need that it's going to be collaboration. Like you see on the picture on the right, collaboration within the state, and as you can see on the picture on the left, collaboration with our state partners and then with our own organization. So you're going to have to do some internal work while you flesh out to do external work. And I believe I'm at my 5 minutes. So I just want to say thank you for this opportunity, and I look forward to hearing what my other panelists have to say.
Thank you, Lindsay. And I'm Crystal Tyler Mackey. I serve as a community viability specialist with Virginia Cooperative Extension at Virginia Tech. The work that I do is around community viability, things related to food access, food security, civic dialogue, facilitation and leadership, as well as partnering with communities to address any other critical or emerging issues that might arise. I am a part of the Virginia team along with my colleagues. Pictured in the slide to the left is Thomas Woodson, who is one of our amazing 4-H extension agents based in Amelia County. And my colleague, Dr. Mari Smith, in the middle, who is a 4-H state specialist with Virginia State University, which is Virginia's 1890 institution. And so we came together as our team. We were very excited to attend the training, and we went with full support from our administration, who were really eager for us to get a plan together before we even went. But we went, and I would say that our experience at the Coming Together for Racial Understanding training was extremely intense, but also very enlightening. I'll say challenging, and challenging was both personally and professionally challenging. In some ways, and Leonardo mentioned this a lot to us, that we'd have to sit with this discomfort of things being undone. And for some of us who, we appreciate getting things done, knowing that things were undone and being challenged in that way provided some discomfort, but it needed discomfort. Coming together with people from across the nation with so many varied experiences in life, and in particular with race and racism, really challenged us, but it also motivated us to do something, to want to do something, to do more. The being together, as Lindsay just mentioned, and recognizing that we're not alone really encouraged and spurred us on to want to do more. And so in Virginia, our plan was to really recognize that there's a need to do more of the work internally as a first step. And so we came back and we reported back to our administration, who again was really ready for us to hit the ground running. And we shared with them that we really need to do some work internally within our own organization first before moving out to communities, and received a great deal of support with that. And so we had coming up shortly thereafter our annual 4-H training, which pulls together all of our extension agents and specialists in 4-H youth development. And we use that as an opportunity to share a little of what we learned, a little of what we experienced at the training, and ask for some feedback about our thoughts, what our plans might be, and ask them for some guidance of what they thought would be great to do, and some cautions or red flags that they thought. We wanted to use it as an opportunity to learn from them, and we got some excellent feedback and support, and we were spurred on even more from that opportunity. And so we'll be partnering with our diversity fellows, and our diversity fellows in Virginia are extension agents who apply and are assigned a portion of their time to do some work around diversity, equity, and inclusion, more along the training lines. But as you would imagine, they are very excited about partnering with us on this work. And so we will be exploring using the Everyday Democracy model in a 2-day format internally with extension faculty, staff, and administration who are interested and willing in attending those. We're looking to do those in this coming year, and then gleaning from that on our plan for rolling out into communities. Our key takeaway, or my key takeaway, was just the opportunity to be together and spend a week really focused on the work, doing some of the work ourselves, and then considering models for bringing this work back to our organizations and to our communities left me feeling very encouraged. The diversity of people who showed up and took the time to do what was not easy work really was encouraging. And while there's a plethora of work to be done, we know that we're not doing the work alone. So I thank you. I thank you for the opportunity and look forward to connecting further.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tamara Ajay, and I hail from the great state of Tennessee by way of Tennessee Extension. Within our land grant system, we have our 1862 institution, which is the University of Tennessee Extension, and our 1890 institution is the Tennessee State University. We serve 95 counties across the state. My position title is Family and Consumer Sciences Extension Agent. My work is primarily concentrated in the areas of family, food, health, money, and just very excited to be serving the Clarksville-Montgomery County. I had the great pleasure of attending the Coming Together for Racial Understanding training this past summer in Chevy Chase, Maryland. And my extension administrators were very passionate about this work that was being done. And our state team is working very diligently to prepare for a spring Train the Trainer workshop. And so right now we are doing lots of work around pulling out some key objectives that we really want to impart with our extension colleagues. And so I'm just very fortunate to be a part of the steering committee and share with you today about how transformative this work has been in my personal life, as well as sharing it with my colleagues and my administrators, and how we can really make a difference and mobilize some encouraging work from this curriculum. So thank you.
Hello, my name is Shatomi Luster Edward. I have a dual role. I have a responsibility here in the state of Missouri with the University of Missouri, but then I also have an appointment with E-Extension as the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Fellow. And so that allowed me, my primary work with diversity, equity, and inclusion has been with the University of Missouri, but primarily been with E-Extension. And it's allowed me to get, if you will, a 50-foot view of what is going on throughout our nation as it relates to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So in addition to the Coming Together for Racial Understanding, a part of my responsibility was also to look at what other trainings, what other programming, what other things are out there. And so so when I looked at that 50-foot view, I saw some key programs, and one of them being the civil dialogue. And this is where I had the opportunity to meet many of the panelists that are on board right now, in addition to a lot of people throughout the nation, and one of the reasons why Rich and I connected. And so in addition to the civil dialogue, also saw navigating differences, healing racism, and racial taboo. But a lot of the feedback that I received was, Shatomi, hey, we really don't have too much going on, or we don't know what's really going on, or we know what's going on, but I feel like I'm somewhat on an island out there by myself trying to figure out this whole diversity, equity, and inclusion. So one thing that you'll see, those 4 quadrants up there, is understanding people's motivation. And part of that understanding people's motivation was me taking a step back and listening and learning. And then understanding who are the leaders in this, currently in this space of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and the national partners, which were mentioned earlier, ECOP, NIFA, USDA, those are, and obviously E-Extension, and what are we doing to create a little bit more awareness as it relates to DEI. And then what is that innovation part? So you heard a lot of the panelists talk about not only coming together for racial understanding, but also the summit that took place with E-Extension. And it's really digging down deep and understanding what needs to be done in this space and maybe what needs to be done from a creative standpoint. But through my understanding and listening to other people, you'll notice on the next slide that we have a website, and this website is dei.extension.org. And so with DEI, the goal here was to take it to the basics. And you'll see on the left-hand side where it says phase 1. That's exactly what this is. This is how do we define DEI from a nationwide standpoint as a extension unit, and then what are those components? So you'll see across that across the slide about us framework and DEI competency areas. Really want to hone in on the framework and the DEI competency areas. Understanding what steps do I need to take? Think of the framework as you building a building and house. And how do we go about doing that? And then you'll also see the competency areas. The competency areas were purposefully built that way. When you look at it, you'll see the understanding implicit bias. You have to know self first in order to move on to those microaggressions, and then also understanding various cultures as far as cultural competency, and then promoting civility and social justice. There are a few things that when we move into phase 2 that you will see additions. You will also see other players brought to the table, and you also might be asked to be a part of a national organization. So from an E-Extension standpoint, I was able to look at that from a 50-foot view again, from a nationwide view, obtain feedback, get feedback, and then relay that to our leadership as well as our colleagues. So I'm really excited to be a part of this team, and I'm really excited to continue to hear the feedback and the questions that you all have throughout this webinar.
All righty, we want to thank our presenters for giving us some amazing thought starters for our conversation on today. And just want to remind you that you can enter your questions in the Q&A box, and we will be answering those as we go. And also keep your eye on it, because the presenters may answer those questions directly in the question and answer box, and we won't necessarily bring those forward in the conversation. So you can keep your eye out there for answers as well. As I said earlier, you guys did an amazing job in sharing questions with us. And so I'm going to kick off the question and answer portion with one of the questions that we received. And presenters, if you would just wave at me and let me know if you'd like to answer this one. So the question is, how important is it that extension acknowledge and eradicate systems of inequity within extension? And in particular, they asked about an example of the marginalization and minoritization of the 1890 institutions. So the question is, how important is it? You heard Leonardo say at the beginning that when people went to the training, and you've heard it repeated by a couple of the participants as well, speakers, that doing our own work matters. So how important is it that extension acknowledge and eradicate the systems of inequity within extension? So I'm looking for a raised hand, someone to let me know that you want to take that question. Okay, Leonardo, thank you.
So I would say that it's at the core of the work that we need to do, that we can't do work in our communities and profess to be a resource if we aren't doing that same work internally within our organizations. I think it makes us more relevant to the work that we're doing in community settings. And I think it's at the core of why we have institutions that are designated as 1890s and 1994s. Had extension and the system of extension really lived into equity and inclusion in its roots, then we might not have, or we might have a different configuration than what we currently have. So it's a part of our history, and if we can't be honest with the history of our organization, then I think that will show up in detrimental ways as we do this work in communities.
Okay, thank you for that. And we have panelists from 1890 institutions. Would one of you like to speak to that as well when you think about this in terms of the work going forward at your institution? Lindsay, would you like to address that one as well?
Yes, I didn't know. I'd like to just add a small point to that. I really like how Leonardo stated it as being at the core of our work. I definitely think it's something very central. As a newer professional to Extension and learning about the history, I'd known about my institution, I think a little bit more than I'd known about the overall history of Extension. But one of the things that always I found kind of not necessarily disheartening, but surprising when I would talk to people is that, like, just the history of Extension, people not knowing where it came from, the Smith-Lever Acts, how it's the way funding has been a direct result of segregation or segregationist policies. I think that when people delve into the history a little bit more and we look at the time and how long policies last, then we can see some of the historical precedent that has set us in this situation that we're currently in. And then I hear a lot of times people frame Extension as a minority or as being majority of a certain persuasion or a certain demographic. And then I always remind people, Thomas Monroe Campbell, our first Extension agent, was an African-American gentleman. And I think that I always like to bring that to the forefront to people just because it can remind people that the history of Extension has always been diverse. It has always been varied. So I think that kind of helps with the 1890 and 1862s. That's our 1890s have been putting out that type of work. So I think when people look at, my biggest point of that is just to look at the history and the way the legislation that defines our funding, where it derived from and where it came from. I think it's surprising to some folks.
Okay. Thank you for that, Lindsay. Rachel, can you remind us a little bit about who convened this coming together for racial understanding?
For the training, we did an open invite to all the states, initially through the extension directors and administrators, since ECOP was the body that gave us the charge for this work. And we just opened it across the United States. And as it was mentioned earlier, we limited to 20 states because that allowed us to have the intimacy we needed for building trust and having conversations. And so it was kind of a first 20 states that got their teams together and registered.
Okay.
I will just mention, it also came up in a chat. We do have plans for setting a second training that will be sometime in 2019. We don't have dates yet, but if there are states that are interested in participating, we do plan on having another opportunity soon.
Okay. All right. Thank you for that. Our next question is, what advice can you give to address food system inequities within a major nonprofit food bank distributor who is aware of racial injustice, but their practices show racial inequities in the food distribution to a minority of white community members, although there is a great need for food within ethnic populations in the county? Perhaps one of our, who would like to take a shot at that particular question? If I could see your hands. Trying to watch for you at the same time. Not seeing your hands. Tamir, would you like to take that question?
I sure can.
Thank
I
you.
really think that finding out what the barriers are is critical into determining, excuse me, I can't talk, determining where the problem lies. Really having those hard conversations, as we had talked about earlier, as doing some internal work, and then identifying where the breakdown lies. So there may be a systemic issue that has happened that they may not be aware of, but maybe getting a committee together or a community together that really has a passion for the work, and has a passion for the topics regarding civil dialogue and civil discourse, and then delving deeper into those problems and finding out, how can we move forward? And I think the everyday democracy and the training that we attended really spoke to that, how to have those difficult conversations and then how to proceed. One of the examples that I can give is that we actually had to do a community assessment where participants actually look at the resources that are available in the community, and they do a grading or a scale, so to speak, of how they would rate their community. And so I think a system such as that, or an activity such as that, with a powerful committee that is geared towards seeing change, would really be beneficial.
Okay, great. Thanks for that. Anyone like to add to that before we go to the next question? Okay. All right, great. We have a question out of UC Davis, and they indicate they were not a part of the meetings that were held already, but are working on an internal institute for several years. So how would we recommend for a group, what do we recommend for a group that is not already involved in these efforts to most effectively tap into this particular group, our work group's expertise and experience to work in this place locally? So they're asking for us, in terms of our expertise in working in this work around racial equity in the food systems, how do they tap into the expertise in this work group? Lucy, would you like to talk about that and share a bit about your vision of that?
Sure. I can speak briefly about that, but then maybe somebody who's been part of some of these other national efforts might want to join in. And what I would say there is, primarily, I think that's one of the things that we as a group are really thinking about now. We've done a lot of work this year to try to convene a national steering committee and really think about what we are doing and what we want to do. But I think for us, that is an unanswered question, which is beyond sort of the webinars. How can we engage more and how can we bring more people in? And so this is probably not a satisfying answer, but if you have ideas, if anybody on the webinar has ideas, it would be great to hear from you about what might be useful or what that might look like from you. But I'm wondering also if anybody who participated in the Coming Together for Racial Understanding training has anything to say about, are there places to access some of those resources? Are there ways for people who weren't in those original 20 states to learn more about the trainings that you received?
So Lucy, this is Shitomi. I'll jump in. To the question that was posed, I think it is exactly what you're doing now. Participating in the webinars, voicing these types of questions so we know who to reach out to. Half of the battle is understanding who is interested, and half of the battle is convening those who have the passion to move this forward, right? Because a lot of times when in our positions, we have a lot of things going on, and trying to focus our efforts on such an important topic such as this is the hard part. So if you can reach out to one of us, that would be awesome. Or we can just take your information from this particular webinar, because indeed there are efforts that are going on nationally, and it's us identifying who wants to be a part of those efforts, so then we can disperse it, if you will, or have it out to the greater good and our team nationally, so then we can move this work forward.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you. We have another question about the training, actually, wanting to find out about what's going to be offered in 2019, and curious in terms of saying that the leadership may not be really responsive to the invitation and would like to know a little bit about it so that they can organize their peers and encourage their leadership to put a team together to attend. So those of you who went, you went with your leadership's blessing. Could you share a little bit about what was the conversation with your leaders, and how did you overcome any potential resistance, or respond to and give an exquisite invitation, as I like to call it, to invite you to go to this training. So can we hear from each of you who went to the training and your interaction with your leadership?
I can kick it off, Renee.
That'd be great.
So our conversation with the leadership before and after, it was pretty supportive. They heard the call from ECOP and knew that this was something that was coming on board nationally, and they wanted us to be involved, and also wanting to kind of see where we were. And I think some good advice that I had gotten from the training was basically, when we get back, you know how administration is, how leaders can be, to not just expect them to already have a plan and tell us, like, this is what I want you to do, get to work, go ahead and do it, but to be at the training and to come back with, hey, I went to this training and this is what I think we should do, and would you okay this, can we go forward with it? So I think one thing that helped was already having a plan for them to get on board versus looking for them to give us a plan to be dictated. So I think that was helpful in our case, and I know it's going to vary.
Okay.
Thanks, Renee. And I can piggyback off of that as well.
Sure.
So in Virginia, you know, our administration was certainly supportive of us going, but like Lindsay, there was not a blueprint or, you know, the details of a plan of how we would implement the work. They knew at a high level that they believed that the work was important to happen in Virginia, but the how they needed to hear. And so when we went with the, you know, the support, and we came back and had the support, and when they were eager to have us hit the ground running, we were able to, you know, have thought through and planned out ahead of time what we thought would make the most sense, and be able to clearly articulate what that plan was, with some support of why we thought that was the best plan of action. Again, in Virginia, that was for us to take a step back and do some of the work internally first.
Mm-hmm.
And so coming with not just a we need to go, but some thoughts of how it could be useful and how it could be implemented and rolled out in a way that is positive and productive.
All right, great. And what about you, Tamara?
So to piggyback off of that, we had full support of our administrators, and they were excited about the training, the content that was being delivered, and they wanted to be sure that we were involved across both universities. And we went knowing that this is something that they wanted us to bring back. So like Lindsay and Crystal, there was also no blueprint for how to deliver this message to our colleagues, as well as how do we move into that to taking it to the community. So right now, our state initiative team, we started with 3. We've grown probably by several more, and I really think that's important, bringing in other key leaders and key people that really have a passion for the work, to sit down, really define and hammer out those objectives of what are we wanting the takeaway to be, and what is most important. So having to prioritize what's most important and how to deliver is where we're at. But they are excited. They've been asking questions. They're involved every step of the way when it comes to the planning. And so it was comforting knowing that they wanted this done, and they want to do it right. And having this framework has given us the ability to make sure we're doing it correctly.
Okay, great. And Shitomi, what was Extension Foundation's motivation, you know, as an organization that supports cooperative extension professionals for your participation?
So for my participation, the motivation is really understanding the pulse of the community, and understanding that what's currently happening in our community are certain things that are things that we most definitely have to address. And we have to be a lot more proactive rather than reactive in the space that we're in. So the motivation was to, one, again, really understand nationally what types of training, what types of programming, what types of things are out there as it relates to DEI. And me taking that back to our leadership, I can tell you from the insider standpoint, if you will, that our administration and our leadership is trying to be a lot more intentional on reaching out to administrators in our local areas to not only help with our agents that are out there selling it to the administrators, but to aid in that message. So not only are they hearing one message, but they're hearing another message, and maybe they're hearing another message to understand the importance of it.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. Thank you for that. So our next question is how we get invitation to the training sent to everyone on this webinar. And the point here is that administrators are not always people that are moving the DEI work forward in the state. So Rachel, for the folks participating on the webinar, what's the best way for them to get invited to the next training? What would that process be?
Yeah, I did put the link to the project over in the chat box. You can look at that.
Okay,
and
great.
Also, I'm going to jump out there a little bit and ask if we might possibly, if we can send an invite through the participants to this group. We would be glad to do that, so we'll certainly check on that. Otherwise, I would be perfectly happy to just put you on a list. That's kind of old school, but if you want to email me if you're interested, I would certainly be glad to make sure that you get an invitation.
Okay, all right, thank you. And we can probably address that with our listserv for those who decide to accept our invitation and be able to share it with the notes that go out. So the next question is, how is Cooperative Extension governed, and who makes the decisions about how funding is dispersed between 1862 and 1890 universities? Are there any books or resources that we would, so let's leave, that's two questions here. So the first question is, how does Cooperative Extension governed, and who makes the decisions about funding between 1862s and 1890 universities? Who'd like to take that? I'm not sure who to direct that one to. Rich, is that something that you could answer for us?
I think that's an extension administrator question, and I'm not an extension administrator. So.
Okay, sure.
I can add a little something to it, Renee.
Sure, go ahead, Lindsay.
So from my knowledge, I'm not sure if it varies for every state, but I know here in Alabama, it's definitely things at the federal level. But one of the things that I would want to point to, I know this might have been two questions, but a resource on this would be a book called Disparity by Rupert Seals. And it was his career. He had a career where he set out as an extension agent. He was confused in funding. He was like, why do 1890s receive less funding than 1862 organizations? So he made his career researching disparity in funding. And he has a book called Disparity, and it talks about the disparity in land grant funding and where does it originate and how has it been. And like I said, a lot of it is historical. So you're going back to looking in the Smith-Lever Acts and like looking at how things have changed over time. So if anyone wants to know a little bit about the topic of disparity within funding between the 1890s and the 1862s, I would definitely recommend that book by Rupert Seals called Disparity.
Okay, great. If you could drop that name in the Q&A box, that would be excellent. Thanks for that.
I would also add real quick, Renee, that in addition to what Lindsay said, the researching the first Morrill Act of 1862 as well will also provide some guidance on just the whole concept and how even land grant universities and institutions came about. So the Morrill Act, as well as just the land grant, just the agriculture, like Lindsay said, from the federal standpoint in the Farm Bill.
Okay. All right, great. All right, so the next question gets right to also the heart of this issue of racial equity or inequities. What are our thoughts about food sovereignty versus food charity? And I'm going to ask Crystal if she would jump in, share her thoughts on your thoughts on food sovereignty versus food equity.
Is it food sovereignty versus food charity?
I mean food charity. I'm sorry. Yes, thank you.
I'm not sure that I feel confident fully addressing this question on behalf of our steering committee or on behalf of our work group. There's certainly a lot of talk and discussion around both, and food and discussion for the need for equity in both, helping to move people toward food sovereignty and in the immediate, providing charitable opportunities for immediate needs.
Okay, all right. Thanks a lot. Anyone else like to address that one? Oh, hey, Rich. Go ahead.
This is related, but I just wanted to share with the group to complement some of the work that we're doing in the racial equity in the food system work group. Our center is currently finishing an environmental scan of racial equity and food justice metrics that are being used in the food system, how those terms are actually being used in both in the private sector and the nonprofit sector and state and institutions and government. And that report will be out in January or February. And we're actually, to follow up with that here in Michigan, we're hiring a postdoc on food sovereignty and racial equity to take that national scan and drill deeper here in Michigan to see what really is relevant ways to be able to assess and measure change with a food lens in work around racial equity and food sovereignty. So and we will be sharing that in the webpage and the listserv as time moves on in the next several months.
Okay, great. Thanks, Rich. Thanks. The question came up is at the conference, was there talk about reparations for Black folks and how this could help lead to building racial equity in our food system? Did that come up in the discussion?
I would have to say, if it did, it wasn't voiced aloud. It was bigger than just reparations. It was learning to really understand each race, each gender, and where our needs lie. And so it may have been a side conversation, but the focus was not specifically on reparations for Black folks and how to reclaim that kind of thing. I think it was a larger picture than that. At one point in the training, we went into our affinity groups and people that look like us, and we were able to discuss in a safe environment some things that were of concern to our race as a whole. The wonderful part about that is that at the end of meeting with our affinity groups, we were able to come together, all the races, and able to share and have a dialogue that was of understanding. It was of healing, of empathy, and a lot of self-reflection. You left that training wondering or learning how you can make some things happen and how to show up as you truly are without having any fear, and how to make some things happen in the community.
Okay, thank you for that. Thank you for that. Our next question asks, how do we engage or interact with other food justice organizations who have already begun this work or are in the process of activating through a racial equity lens in the communities and the counties where they work? And so in the things that you've done coming to this work, because we all had beginnings before coming to the work group, can you share a little bit about your interactions with others and your experiences? So if each of you could just take a moment and talk about what your experience has been that brought before coming to this work group.
So I can tell you, this is Shitomi, I can tell you from an extension standpoint that we definitely value partnership, and not only partnerships within our organization, but also partnerships outside of our organization. We, as you all know very well, that you learn from others, and that creates a learning community. So engaging and interacting with and understanding other partners that are in this space, in this field, and other organizations is something that we definitely have done and definitely will continue to do. Within the summit for E-Extension, we actually had outside partners who came in to observe, as well as provide feedback to and towards the different institutions that presented during the summit. And that gives an opportunity to provide and learn and get feedback from someone who's also in this space.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you for that. So as we're looking forward here, the question is, what is the role or participation of Indigenous people and the tribal land grants, in this particular project? Rachel or Leonardo, maybe one of the two of you could speak to that in terms of from what you've seen in participation thus far and what you're looking when you look forward. What's the role in participation of Indigenous people and tribal land grants, in this training initiative?
And I may have misunderstood the question, so I'm going to stick something in there and let Leonardo certainly join.
Okay.
It sounded like the question was about the project, so I wasn't sure if it was about the foods project specifically, which is different from coming together. On the coming together, I would just say that what we have planned in our second training in 2019 really is to move the training a little more accessible to the Western states. If you look at the states that participated, we had more participation from the eastern half of the U.S. because we had the training in the East. And so our plans are to be more available geographically to the Western states. And this time we also have plans to specifically bring some people that can help us ensure that we have the Native American voice in this conversation. Leonardo, I don't know what else you may add there on this piece, then we need to leave space for the work on the foods to also answer.
Yeah, I think it's critical again to the work that we need to be doing, not only within Extension, but as a nation. And one of the important things that I'm learning as I work more with our 1994 tribal partners is that we're at different stages of development within our organizations. And so for us to ask something as far as involvement or engagement in this process might not mesh with where they are as in the development of as an institution themselves. And so keeping that in mind, though, I think as much as we can engage leadership and individuals of those institutions with this work, I think it's important. And one of the questions that I always put in the heads of our extension staff in Michigan is if we're working with tribal communities and our tribal partners, we can ask ourselves all the time, what is our role as extension educators or administrators to support the sovereignty of the tribal nations in our state? And I think it's an important question because that means that we do a lot of listening versus us talking and saying, this is how we're going to determine your sovereignty. And so maybe a little bit broader answer to this question, but I think it's an important way for us to look at these institutions within our relationships have disparities, and we should look at the disparity of wherever an organization is within our land-grant university systems to be something about not wanting to be involved, but rather what is it that we need to do to make sure that we're addressing some of those disparities.
Okay, all right, great. Thank you for that. There were a couple of questions that were asked, prior to the webinar, and I'm just gonna ask the group to address, one of those questions as well. So how do we combat the resistance by, white colleagues as this work is moving forward toward racial equity? Thoughts about that in terms of how we would address that in our internal work when there's resistance to the work of racial equity within?
Well, I'm going to jump in on this one. I have my personal opinion and professional opinion that some may or may not agree with. However, as it relates to diversity, equity, and inclusion, I think the first thing that comes to mind, and I've said this many a times, is race. And while diversity, equity, and inclusion does include race, it's not the only thing. The reason why you hear the pulse of race is because that is the dominant issue, if you will, when people talk about diversity. And we have to and I'll say sometimes, but we have to get past the race issue. So when you see it presented, you have to talk through it. And so while some people feel like this may not be a comfortable situation or a topic that you want to talk through and or go through, you have to be able, in order to get past something or in order to work through something, you have to be able to communicate about it, right, wrong, or indifferent. And then you're able to move past not only diversity, equity, and inclusion being about race, but also about gender, also about disabilities, also about various things that just as equally sometimes plague our industry. But the reason why you hear and see race is because that's something that needs to be addressed, in my opinion. Okay. Would anybody else say? Leonardo, would you weigh in? Go ahead.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. One is that I'm pretty realistic in the groups that I have chances to interact with within my organization, and it's a predominantly white and historically white organization. And so I have to enter into some conversations when it comes to race around what's the cost to all of us to maintaining these systems that affect all of us. And is to help white people around race understand that these divisions are hurting all of us, and being willing to hear how they might struggle with understanding that, or that they might be interested in talking. And also my role is oftentimes to listen and to support and challenge. And so I think that's one thing. A second thing I would say is that when we're doing DEI work, that as leaders, I think it's really important, whatever direction we're going in and whatever the focus of that work is going to be, to stop our work for a moment as we develop it and say, so what do we expect the pushback to be? And I think that collectively we've heard pushback, we know what it looks like, we know what it might specifically look like related to race or gender identity, and then into focus our attention. And so how are we going to answer that? How are we going to deal with that? And I don't think it takes one individual, it takes actually partnerships and working collaboratively around many of these issues and understand how that benefits all of us.
Great, thank you for that. Anybody else care to weigh in before we move on? Because that's a very powerful question. I mean, it really it came up in a number of the questions that people asked in terms of, coming to this conversation, how do we address this within the institution, particularly if there's areas like in communities, for example. It was, how do you address racial equity in a state that's not very diverse, for example, was another question that came out. What are your thoughts in terms of how we might address when we're working in an area, even beyond the institution, where it's not very diverse in the community, and we're still looking to address racial equity work?
Well, if I could add to that, Renee, I would just say that one of the things that I've heard a lot is like, with this not being a diverse area, I've heard a lot like, well, I've heard other minorities speak and say, well, it always seems like a black and white issue, or, that we don't have that type of population here. And usually it's always seen as very stark, very black and white, very racial, very personal level, and not always systematic or institutional. And so I would just suggest that, one of the things is about, of course, like we talked about this in our circles, was speaking the truth. I heard a quote, it said that the truth is like a lion. It doesn't need to be defended. You let it out, it'll defend itself. So a lot of it is about speaking truths to power. You might be in a room full of a homogenous room. Everyone might look just like you, but you know that certain people hold certain views that infect and impact the lives of other people. And so, and even looking back historically to different movements, I remember looking at the Black Power movement. Stokely Carmichael would tell people that some of the biggest work needs to be done internally among homogenized races. So people that are all together within self, we need to come together, and like how they had us do in the coming together circles, when we come in our affinity groups and it's all of us, we need to talk about our issues. And so even when I speak to my Latin American or my indigenous communities, darker people suffer everywhere globally. And so it's more of a discussion about not just race as in black and white, but the darker person, whether the darkest of whichever race, identifying why these people suffer. And in Caucasian races, that might be the poorer people. It might be people with poverty, but it's about identifying the truth and speaking the truth. And I think, like what Shitomi said, the truth often makes us uncomfortable. But that's where you grow out, your comfort zone, leave it if you want to grow. And so I think it's a lot about speaking the truth. Yes, your community might not be diverse, but it's a reason why it's not diverse. And so that needs to be expressed. That's what I would say.
Okay. All right. Yes. Yes, Rachel, yes. Mm-hmm.
One of the thought comes to my mind in this, and that's really regardless perhaps of race, and that is start with who's ready.
Mm-hmm.
If we're in a large institutions, for instance, hundreds of people, not everybody's going to be ready for the same conversations at the same time. But if we can begin with those of us who are ready to just begin and to start stepping in together, stepping in with each other, then we will begin to grow a culture that will grow into the rest of the institution. But we start with who's ready, regardless. And so that's one thing I really appreciated about our August workshop, is we just came into the room ready and stay engaged. And I think that's a good model for any of this work on diversity and inclusion.
And if I could ask, just you build on that a little bit, and others can jump in who had successful support from administrators, what does ready look like? When you come back, you've done this training, or you're interested in getting involved in doing this work, and you're looking around you within your own organization, how did you detect readiness? What were the clues that told you that these were people that you could enroll and engage in this work?
Renee, I'll start to speak to that. I mean, at its basic level, at its basic core, was fellow colleagues who recognized issues of inequity, and so recognize that there are issues of inequity, and then secondly, believe that we should do something to address that. So just at its core.
Okay. All right, great.
And as Rachel said, the models that we learned were models that are based on people who are willing coming together, because they're models that are based on dialogue, and you have dialogue with people who are willing to share and willing to listen.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Leonardo wanted to jump in.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I would say is that you're not going to run across people necessarily that have a button on their shirt that says I'm ready to engage.
Right.
I think what's going to happen is I really believe at the core of this work, which is connected to a lot of the work that Extension does in community settings and internally, are relationships. So what are we doing individually to create those relationships, to be open to invite people into the conversation or into our circles, and then understand that part of what we want to get to is begin to create an opportunity to see that our lives are connected. So if I'm over here working on this issue that I'm passionate about, I want to connect with somebody who says, I know my work could be improved because I see that I'm not reaching audiences that are more racially or otherwise diverse. And so I think that that's, one way of looking at it. The other thing that I want to go back to a question that was asked early on about how do you engage your leaders to make this a priority. And one of the things that I would really encourage you to do is to use extension history and engaging communities in dialogue processes to find local solutions. That this adds to that template. It adds to the work that extension has done historically and currently. So it's not necessarily something that's new, but it adds a dimension where extension hasn't built the capacity in many ways that we should have along the way. And so part of it is dialogue, part of it is relationship building, and another part of it is connecting with a sense of humbleness. We don't have all the answers, but working with others, we can create new realities for all of us.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. And here's a question building on this topic of readiness. So how do we respond to extension agents and administration who say that this work is political? How do we respond to that?
So Renee, this is Shatomi. I want to jump in on the response of ready. In addition to what Leonardo said, people will not walk around with a button that says I'm ready. And so I would also add on to when you're looking at relationships, you also look at opportunity. There has been opportunities here at our institution where you build upon and you find that support system and you do lean into it, because oftentimes, sometimes the people that are ready are not the only people who should be at the table. And so when opportunity does arise, an opportunity within your community, incidents of the things that happen, then you take that as a learning opportunity and as a learning experience. So not only do you lean in on the people who are ready, but you also lean in what Leonardo said is with relationships, but also with opportunity.
Excellent. Okay. Well, I'm going to ask this question. So I'm not sure if I might have missed the first part of this question, but how does the Farm Bill address this? Does the Farm Bill address racial equity in the food system? I'm not sure.
That may possibly be a reference to the fundings, the way that 1890s are funded.
Oh, okay. All right.
I'm not going to speak definitively. I do know that there was some language in there that would bring 1890 funding to a more equitable relationship. And I would say it's not a complete answer, but if that language passed, then there was some progress made, baby steps.
Okay. So here's a question. So how helpful would it be to have extension directors really working to address these issues? So how do we give them the opportunity to present their current state of DEI in their state and develop some goals and things that they can do and how that might be measured? How do we get the directors really involved in addressing these issues around diversity, equity, and inclusion? For those of you who had administrators who were very supportive, and you look at that model, how do we get others to really look at this and look at the goals in the states that we represent and to establish goals that are measurable?
Renee, we've had wonderful support in Michigan, and I would say one of the reasons is because this adds another piece to our portfolio of work that we've been doing consistently over time on this issue. And I'm going to also put right next to that we have a whole lot of work to do. But what was really important was that we had champions of this work, people like Rich and others who said this is going to add value to the work we're already doing, and specifically will engage the opportunity for us to build internal capacity. And so I think those were two important pieces that came out of conversations with our director, and again, continuing work that we've invested in over time.
Okay, okay. Here's a question that kind of took us back to the question around the readiness. So the question is, so beyond the button, if we have people who want to be ready, but they're finding it's uneasy to indicate that they are because they're afraid that they're not able to engage as expected, how do we help people have some comfort in coming forward in their discomfort or even in the lack of readiness, but they want to, but afraid to not look ready? How do you invite people to step into this, to lean into this, and do it afraid, do it unready, and just lean into it in their roles as extension professionals? How do we invite people to do that?
I think people are already having this conversation, these conversations, and just explaining to people that, you know, we're going to have it at on a much larger scale, but also, I guess, giving them a little bit of a warning that, you know, the work is uncomfortable at times. And I like how, I think it was Shatomi, she may have said, you grow from that, or Lindsay, you grow from the uncomfortability. But through that, if you can stay the course and you can, you know, reflect upon your growth and, you know, all of the other barriers that you may be feeling or faced with, I think they'll be surprised, and the feeling is rewarding. The takeaway is rewarding. And knowing that they are champion, I love that word, Leonardo, that you use, but that they're a champion for this work, it outweighs the uncomfortability.
Right. Great. Thank you. So I've been asked to kind of come back to the question. I'm sorry, Leonardo, you want to say something?
I just really quickly want to add that I think I would identify 3 important characteristics of a culture that can include people in this conversation. One of them is individuals or leaders that support vulnerability. None of us have all the answers, but if we can engage with each other and create a sense of vulnerability that's supported, I think that's important. That we are willing to take risks, because I don't think we can do this work without taking risks. And we're in the situation that we're in this moment in our country because there are people scared of taking risks for really important reasons, but still create that environment where that is something nurture. And then the last thing quickly is just creating a culture where we're calling people in instead of calling people out. So we're inviting people into this process instead of saying, because of what you said or did, you need to go through this training or you need to be involved in this. And sometimes that's hard to do when you're the target of this, but I think it's a way to say we all need to be involved and have a place at this table.
Okay. I'm going to loop back to a question, and this is going to be the last question for the Q&A, and any questions that we didn't get addressed, we'll continue the dialogue as we get into our listserv and future webinars. But the question around how do you respond to people who say this is political? Whitney, who asked that question, would like to hear us say a little bit more about that. I mean, when somebody says to you, this is political, and so that's their way of saying they really don't, you know, they're not going to engage in it because it's political. What do you say to them?
You say, yes, it is. And I think life is political, and we try to navigate the best that we can, and also create a culture where we have assurances that if we stick to our mission and stick to what we know as our truths, that we'll get supported organizationally. I really think that yes, this is political. Yes, we may come across, or it may seem like we have a bias, but I think everything that we do within our academic settings has a bias. We just need to be more open that this is something that both has it has an agenda towards creating more inclusive, equitable environments.
Wonderful, and thank you for that answer. And so this has been a really, really great exchange. We want to thank everyone again for all of the questions, and we know that not every question was answered. A number of them were answered in the Q&A box, and so we have those. And I want to thank you and ask you to continue to participate. At this time, I'm going to turn it to Rich, and he's going to tell you a little bit about the resources that are available through this work group. Rich?
Thank you very much, Renee, and thank you for the wonderful job you did moderating today. We're all a lot of thumbs up here, and I'm sure all around the country.
All right, thanks.
So, folks, this is just a beginning. You know, this racial equity in the food system work group is one resource. It's just building adequate capacity. We now have a web page. Within the next week, hopefully by Monday or Tuesday, everybody that registered will get a web page link. Now, I know there's just less than 200 people on now, but I want you all, the ones that are still on here, we had over 700 people registered from 47 different universities and 44 states. That's just the EDU addresses alone. Mm-hmm. There is a lot of interest, even though they all didn't show up today. The interest is there. We're going to be mailing all 700 plus of those people all this information and an invitation to join this new listserv called Equity Food. There will be instructions in the email that you all will receive on how to join it. We don't want to force you to be on the listserv, but you'll have an opportunity to follow one or two simple instructions to join it. That's where we'll continue this discussion, including some of the unanswered questions. Definitely in the new year, things might be a little slow over the holidays, but this committee is totally passionate about continuing this work. We have a little bit of financial resources, which helps. We're just so happy to have all of you join and be part of this conversation today. And I'll just end by saying something that a participant in the Coming Together for Racial Understanding workshop said about this work in cooperative extension, is that if we don't do this work, why are we doing any of the other work we're doing? This work is at the core of, and has to be in the DNA of not only an extension educator, but the others of us that work in education around food, health, and agriculture. So, and on behalf of the extremely passionate committee, I also want to thank Luke Reese here for the IT service he has provided, and I wish all of you just to continue continue this work, and we will be staying in touch with you. And so thank you all. And again, on behalf of the group, we wish you all the best over the next few weeks and however you celebrate the holidays. And we'll continue full energy in 2019. So thanks all.